It's got two jobs. What's the other one?
Not to do that at the right time.
Not to activate that sequence when it's not required. Okay? We spend a lot of time focusing on the first job, the activation sequence, but as skydivers, we tend to put very little thought into those scenarios of where the AAD doesn't want to activate. There's a lot of scenarios where we don't want it to come out. Can we think of a few offhand? High-speed turns. In the aircraft with the door open, bad place to have that happen, right? So there's areas where we don't want the AAD to activate. So we just want to look at the AAD as more than just a calculator, more than just a pin pusher or a cutter pusher, but it also has the role and responsibility of not firing when we don't want it to. So the next 45 minutes of slides that I'm going to go through are just going to create some scenarios to get you thinking about the different possibilities that we're putting our AADs in today versus when we first started. I was really fortunate to have a conversation with Helmut earlier today. The first AADs came on the market in 1992, right? Is that right?
As we spoke, there were AADs,
yeah.
There were AADs much earlier, maybe
yeah.
25 years earlier.
Thank you. For those of you who aren't familiar with Helmut, if I was up here giving a presentation on building tandem harnesses and Bill Booth was in the back, that'd be the anxiety level I'm under. If I was, if I was giving a presentation on building parachutes and John LeBlanc was sitting in the back, that's the level of anxiety I'm under. Helmut Cloth from AirTech, creator of the Cyprus, so he's here. So best scenario here is that everything that I'm bouncing off you, he is a perfect person to get a secondary advice from and secondary conversation after the presentation's over. Okay, so originally, the idea of the AAD was to set it and forget it. We turned it on at the beginning of the day, and that was it. We forgot about it. It was back there, but we never really gave it much thought. We would skydive throughout the course of our day, and this unit was so convenient, it even turns itself off, right? All you had to do was turn it on, didn't even have to turn it off. And that set it and forget it mentality was one of the strengths of putting one of these in your system. It didn't require a lot of user interfaces, a lot of user input, which helped keep that basic function very basic. It prevented the end user from interfering with the function of the system. There were always auxiliary functions such as altitude offsets, but for most skydivers, for most of the time, you turned it on and you never thought twice about it, right? That was its intent then, and it's still effectively the intent now, but the difference, from my perspective, is that back when AADs were first becoming popular within the sport skydiving community, we were all skydiving pretty much in one orientation. And what orientation was that? Belly to earth, right? RW. Competitive FS. Well, now we have multiple different orientations. We've got head down, feet up. That's the same thing. Head down, head up, back flying, wingsuit flying. Anybody ever fly a sky surfboard? All right, my brothers. There's three of us in the room. There's still sky surfing. It's I think one of the greatest things about the sport, but that's another story for another presentation. The point is, there's a number of different scenarios today that maybe or maybe not, when the AADs were first conceived and put on the market, they maybe not necessarily envisioned these sort of parameters that the human body and the human mind would subsequently put the equipment through. One of the worst things we can do for any piece of equipment, whether it's an AAD, whether it's a parachute, or even a harness container system, is to operate it and use it outside of the parameters within which it was designed for. Any tandem instructors in here? What's the maximum load of a tandem system? 500 pounds? Does that sound familiar to people? Can it be jumped at 700 pounds? Of course it can. The webbing tensile strength is thousands of pounds. But our operating limits are 500 pounds, and they're 500 pounds for a reason. So AADs are no different. They have parameters just like harnesses and just like parachutes. Well, speaking of the AAD's parameters, for most of us, the daily routine is to turn it on and forget about it. But the reality is the AAD is doing potentially three things every time it leaves the ground to make a skydive. Those three things are: one, arming itself; two, a possible activation if it's required, if it meets its criteria of measurement; and three, a deactivation, and that's on every jump. So what is the arming of the AAD? What does that mean? It sounds scary and official, but what does that mean? What happens when your AAD arms?
It becomes capable of firing if it's needed. And before it arms, even if you're in free fall, it won't fire.
Perfect answer. It becomes capable of performing that second function, that activation sequence. Okay? There's two primary units out there in the market right now, the Cyprus 2 and the Vigil 2, and I'm going to give you the parameters of each, just one slide for each one. No one is better or worse than the other. Each one has reasons for them. And if you have questions about why one does one versus the other, fortunately, it's a symposium. We have Helmut here and Willie's out in the conference area or the symposium area with the Vigil booth, so you can get more information regarding each one. But it's important to understand that neither unit, say 50 feet off the ground, are going to activate if they were to reach those parameters. Okay? They haven't achieved an armed status where they are allowed, if you will, to fire and cause an activation. So that's our arming altitude. We're going to discuss each one per unit, or at least address them and give you each number. Second is the activation. That's a pretty clear one. Everyone understands that the activation is that process of a piston pushing a cutter through a cylinder if certain criteria are met. What are those criteria again? Approximately 78 miles per hour at 750 feet or lower. Okay. While we're at it, I mentioned approximately a few times. Is the unit actually an altimeter? Does it have a dial inside it? Or how is it determining this? It's just a piece of hardware. It's some lights and some buttons and some wires and some batteries. What is it doing? It's measuring barometric pressure. Right? Are we all familiar with that? It measures barometric pressure at least 4 times a second, probably more. But it's taking constant samples, and it's using those changes in barometric pressure to determine its altitude. So does that mean it's absolutely accurate? Nope, because barometric pressure changes throughout the day, can change throughout the jump, burbles, things like that, which we're going to cover. So even going further into that activation idea at 750 feet at 78 miles per hour, it's all in the math, right? It's not an actual absolute 750 foot. It could be 790 feet, it could be 720 feet, depending upon what the barometric pressures are, if there's any change there during that process. The last operating parameter is the deactivation stage. Now, 20 years ago, this would have been a relevant conversation. Why does it matter when this turns off? Why does it matter that there's an altitude that your AAD won't fire, even if it reaches that 78 miles per hour or faster at 750 feet or lower? Canopies were really slow back then. In our tandem presentation, I said if I'm under a 500 square foot tandem parachute and I pull down a toggle, what's going to happen? Nothing. Eventually, I'm going to start to turn as that 500 square foot parachute moves slowly through the air. But today we have parachute manufacturers like NZ Aerosports and Performance Designs that are building parachutes that are capable of descending at speeds over 100 miles an hour towards the ground. You guys are familiar with the Peregrine and the Petra. Those are really fast parachutes, easily capable of surpassing the activation parameters at or below 750 feet. And as we all know, if that has occurred in the past, and if it occurs again in the future, it could have catastrophic results on every instance that occurs. So it's important to understand these altitudes. So with the Vigil, at 150 feet, it arms, meaning it's capable of firing after it climbs above 150 feet. Its firing altitude is 840 feet, approximately, because it uses the same barometric pressure changes to calculate this altitude. Approximately 840 feet above ground level is the activation altitude. And I'm going to say in a belly to earth orientation, because that sampling, that 4+ times per second where the air samples are being taken on your back in a burble or certain air pressure parameter. It'll fire as high as 1,100 feet, approximately, AGL, if you're back to earth, if that burble changes. Right? So anybody ever fallen unstable in their skydiving career, learning how to skydive? What happens? Your burbles change from high to low, high to low. Do you think any time during that calculation process, if those barometric pressure readings are fluctuating, that it might complicate the process, right, to determine what the altitude is? See how hard Helmut's job is in designing the software? Every time it goes up and down and back and forward, it changes the barometric pressures. And last but not least, at 150 feet above ground level, the unit will shut off. So if at 130 feet you exceed approximately 78 miles per hour, it will not fire. Similarly, Cyprus and Cyprus 2 have similar characteristics. The only real different one is the arming altitude. The Cyprus and the Cyprus 2 will arm at 1,500 feet on the ride to altitude, and 750 foot approximate activation altitude belly to earth and approximately 1,000-foot activation altitude back to earth. So for both units, it's about a 250-foot increase if you're on your back when it activates as opposed to being on your belly. And last but not least, the Cyprus and Cyprus 2 will turn off at 130 feet above ground level. Really, the only primary difference between the two is the altitudes that they activate at. Okay? It's important to know that. If you have a Cyprus and you roll out at 1,200 feet, you want to know, get on your handles. When you're in a Vigil 2, same scenario, there's no reason not to pull your handles, but you want to know that that unit has the capability of firing as well in that process if you reach an altitude, an airspeed of 78 miles per hour or higher. And you can reach that altitude below 750 feet quite easily, especially if you're a big, heavy American like me, 100 kilos. I could break 78 miles per hour in about 3 seconds from, I don't know, 600 feet if I was on my head. So it is possible to exceed those parameters below these activation altitudes. Okay, and then one last comment on Tandem AADs, or a singular comment on Tandem AADs. For those of you that are Tandem instructors, it's also important to know that your Tandem units, whether it's a dedicated unit like Cyprus or Cyprus 2, where it's an actual hardwired unit, or if it's a Vigil 2 unit where you can change the change the function from Pro to Student to Tandem. If you're in that Tandem mode in Vigil 2 or using a Tandem unit from Cyprus 2 or Cyprus, you need to know what those changes are in the activation, arming, and deactivation altitudes. So we'll start with the arming altitude. What's the arming altitude for a Tandem? Tandem instructors in here again? Okay, I'm hearing 3,000 feet, 1,900. Both correct answers, both correct approximate answers based on the units. The Cyprus 2 for Tandem will activate it or arm itself at approximately 2,800 feet. Is that about right? And it's about 1,900 feet for the Vigil 2. So knowing what the system's doing is important if you're using it as a Tandem instructor. Activation altitudes are relatively about the same. Within USPA, we kind of established that 2,000 foot mark, whether it's 2,050 feet or 1,900, it's all about the same altitude for activation. And then the deactivation altitudes are the same, 150 feet and 130 feet respectively for the two systems. So these are really only important to know and understand, or I should say they're most important to be thinking about them in terms of low exits from aircraft. If you're in an aircraft emergency, you've lost an engine, worse, you've lost a wing, and you're getting out of an aircraft low in an emergency situation, it's probably a good idea to know whether or not your AAD is armed to activate if you were to reach that 78 miles per hour or higher at that altitude as you descend. So speaking of descend, let's talk about descent rates. How many of you fly wingsuits? How many of you are acutely aware that with some of the larger wingsuits, you can reach a relative descent rate lower than the 78 miles per hour needed to activate? Okay, same hands should be going up. Everyone's hands should be going up, thank you. Are you aware that there have been wingsuit flyers that have flown through their activation altitudes without activations and have flown their wingsuits into the ground because they lost altitude awareness? Okay, that should be a really big alarm to go off in your head. If you are flying a wingsuit, regardless of the size, whether it's a small, medium, or super large magic carpet, you should have a good understanding of your descent rate so that you can take that descent rate, and whether it's with GPS or whether it's with a Pro Track or an LT Track, you should be able to compare your descent rate with your AAD's firing parameters. So don't raise hands, wingsuiters, but ask yourselves how many of you have done that, compared your descent rates against your AAD to see if you are capable of flying through your deployment altitude, or excuse me, your AAD activation altitude without there being an activation, because we don't want you to be the next person to do that. What about free flying? Can we go really fast when we free fly? Okay. This is the other side of the spectrum. So if we're looking at two outlier events, we've got wingsuiting on one side of this bell curve, and on the other side we have free flying. I don't like to keep pointing out my weight problem, but if I'm flying head down, I've now changed my surface area from belly to earth to head down, and my only surface area is my head, my shoulders, and maybe my arms if I'm still flying in that pizza delivery head down that we first learned. Or it could be going even faster in the more modern wind tunnel flying head down. You can easily reach speeds of 170, 180 miles an hour. So if the AAD is designed to fire when you're traveling at approximately 120 miles an hour, which is about what we consider to be our normal belly to earth orientation, that no pull scenario. If I'm now traveling 180 miles an hour, what's that? 50% faster. How does the math work on that? If I'm traveling 50% faster than some of the speeds that these units were designed initially to deploy at or to activate at, do I reduce my window of operating time if the AAD has to activate? Would you rather be 120 miles an hour belly to earth or 180 miles an hour head down at 750 feet when that AAD chooses to activate? Right? So if I'm a free flyer, fair to say, altitude awareness is critical. Anybody have a friend or know someone that through a free flying jump lost altitude awareness and threw out and had a 2-out scenario because the AAD fired because they were falling so fast? Safe to say, they lost altitude awareness while free flying. That can kill you. It probably will kill someone in the future. Don't want it to be any of you. Think about that. If you're into free flying, what are some of the things you can do to help prevent loss of altitude awareness? Ditters. 1 ditter is good. 2 ditters are better. You might be deaf in your 70s for having 2 buzzers going off in your ears, but you know what? You're still alive to realize you're deaf, and that's way better than the alternative. What? Okay, something else I like to talk about, we don't give a lot of thought to, are jumpsuits. The different jumpsuits that we use create different fall rates. For me personally, I have 3 different types of jumpsuits. I have a really thick poly cotton suit when I'm flying, when I want to fly really slow, under 120 miles an hour. If I'm doing AFF and I'm working with a small person, light person, and I want to fall real slow, rather than have to fly completely de-arched, I put a real big floppy jumpsuit on, a lot of drag, and it slows me down to under 120 miles an hour. Then I also have my, what I like to call mid-drag suit. It's got moderate drag on the arms, moderate drag on the legs. It's my free flying suit. I wear that a lot when I'm doing tandems because it gives me good drag, keeps me at about 120 to 130 miles an hour. Then I have this super tight free fly suit for going real fast. And when I'm in that suit, even in a boxman position, I'm falling at about 145 miles an hour. 1, because of my weight. 2, because there's very little drag on the suit. So even in a belly to earth body position, I can change my fall rate from 110 miles an hour to 120 to 150 simply by changing the suit that I'm wearing. As I illustrated earlier, the worst case scenario is the head down person going 180 miles an hour. But is it fair to say that any increase in speed might possibly reduce my operating window if I have anything like a pilot chute hesitation? Forget for a moment that the AAD, it's irrelevant to that piece of mechanical equipment on your back. It's irrelevant to the AAD how fast you're going when it chooses to activate. Whether I'm going 120 or 180 miles an hour, it's still going to choose to activate at about the same altitude. But what happens after that, that's where the problem starts to build and the domino effect starts to add up. So we think about how fast we go. Put it in another perspective. I live about half an hour from the world's oldest wind tunnel, the Orlando Skyventure Tunnel. Anybody ever flown in that one? It actually operates on a principle that when it's running, it's so loud the earth rejects you inside it and wants to pull you away. It's just horrible. You guys have the recirculated ones. I know on my back in that wind tunnel, just in a neutral, relaxed, back flying body position, similar to being knocked out, I fall at about 145 miles an hour. So I'm smoking in my moderate drag suit at 145 miles an hour, unconscious on my back. So I realize that I'm slightly above that 120 mile an hour typical average speed. Just something to be aware of. I can change that fall rate by changing the suits that I wear. All right, so recently, USPA raised the minimum deployment altitude to 2,500 feet. What was it before that? 2,000. Why did we do that? What's that? Yes, back when we first put that together. Does anybody know when the 2,000-foot activation altitude was first determined? I asked Jim Crouch, the Director of Safety and Training, he's the Director of all things safety for USPA, responsible for this rule. When did it first get put into place? And he said, I'll be damned if I know, sometime in the 1960s. And he said, I think it was even when we had round parachutes. Square parachutes weren't even considered in that thought process. Well, eventually we moved to square parachutes, ram airs. And for any of you that have jumped those original ram air parachutes, we'll talk to those of you that haven't. when you deploy the pilot chute or the spring-loaded pilot chute and your ram air parachute started to inflate, it inflated quite quickly. Sometimes 300 feet, sometimes you would deploy at 2,000 feet and you'd be sitting in at 2,500 feet. It opened so hard you went back up again. I mean, these original square parachutes open very quickly, right? That didn't actually go back up, but you get the point. They open very quickly and briskly. So at 2,000 feet deployment minimum, and again, this is just a recommended minimum altitude. You have all the blessing in the world to open higher. But at that 2,000 foot minimum, main canopies opened quickly. And what did that do? It gave the jumper time to assess the situation and determine if they needed to cut away, release the reserve manually. It gave them altitude to do that. Today, there are main parachutes that take 1,000 feet to open. Anybody jump one? Okay, if you deploy that at 2,000 feet, assuming nothing else happens, there's no malfunctions, you're sitting in at 1,000 feet, right? So what's your minimum decision altitude? 1,800. We've already blown way past that if we choose to open at 2,000 feet. So all this 2,500 foot increase was designed to do was give people a margin for today's modern parachutes so that no matter what parachute they were flying, they still had a likelihood of having a sit-in altitude at 1,800 feet, enough time to determine whether or not there was a problem with that parachute and perform emergency procedures at a high enough altitude. So in recent years, both of the AAD manufacturers, I guess it's been available for a long time, but in recent years it's become a more common thing now for the AAD manufacturers to be able to raise or lower the activation altitudes of your automatic activation devices, those approximate altitudes. And we're seeing a lot of people doing that today. Do you know anybody that's decided to raise their altitude for their AAD? What did you raise it to?
900.
Why did you do that?
I witnessed AAD fire went off at 750 foot, and I watched it snivel past the tree line. When we got round, it just inflated, and he'd broken his hip.
Wow.
Give him 200 foot more.
He walked away, right? So you got first-hand observation of this. Do you know any of the background about what was going on? Was he free-flying?
It was a tracking jump. They were all very experienced blokes.
Yep.
The guy involved was a tunnel rat who wisely picked his gear based on its performance. He had a 175 reserve, and he had thousands of jumps.
Mm-hmm.
The only footage that was seen was from the person on his back, and for all intents and purposes, there's an empty space. But two guys just came in, and it was such a light hit that you wouldn't have thought much of it if you'd have, bumped into each other. But just a little, it was his ankle that hit the top of his head, just enough, and the guy spun and helicoptered himself up. Couldn't see him. And then because he was tracking, he was off in the distance, went behind the tree line, behind the hills. And,
so there was a lot of things going on there. He was on his back, he was potentially spinning.
He was on his front, but as soon as he got hit, he was on his back spinning.
And what orientation do you think the AAD activated at? Was he on his belly, was he on his back, was he unconscious?
I couldn't say.
Just a lot of things going wrong up there, right?
But he was on his back spinning and stayed that way.
Do you know how fast he was going, roughly? Did you look at his, any chance to see data from the jump? No, okay. Well, but there's still a lot of things going on there. So I think that's, I'm not here to tell anyone raise your altitude. I'm not here to tell anyone keep it the same. I'm just here to give you thoughts and suggestions. Everything you just said makes perfect sense to raise it a couple hundred feet, and I'm glad that you took that initiative to get the information and to understand the equipment and make that choice. Okay. All right. My boss, Mark Prokos, is actually next door giving an entire presentation on component compatibility. So if anybody has any questions on this after we get done here, please find him at either the booth with Alan Pixie or at the dinner tonight. He's got a lot of data on this. I'm going to give you the just broad stroke version of it. Okay. How many harness container manufacturers do you think are out there right now? How many? Let's say 10. Okay. Active ones. We got Thomas Sports, we've got UPT, Mirage, Aerodyne. Let's just call it 10, make it a nice round number. Okay. Within each of those 10 harness container manufacturers, how many different individual models do you think they make? Yeah, cool, let's say 15, okay? For everything from a student rig down to the smallest of small. I remember Mirage, for example, so they had like M1, M2, M3, M4, et cetera, UPT, 319, 320, 321, all the different model numbers. Javelin, they used letters, TJN, TJM, TJR, whatever, all these different versions of their systems. So collectively, if we were to lay every single one of them out, every manufacturer and every specific size, it's going to be over 100 harness containers, right? Would we agree that's a reasonable assumption? Now let's talk about main canopies. How many of you can fit multiple main canopies into your harness container? You can fit one in really tight, you can fit one in really loose, and one that fits just right. Is that a fair assumption? Papa bear, mama bear, baby bear. You can fit all three in the same container. So let's say we can put 3 main canopies into every container. That's now what, 300 possibilities? But wait, there's more. We have to now add reserve parachutes. Reserve parachutes, while it's not typically a 3 and out scenario, you can typically fit 2 different size reserves in every harness container system. One that will fit snug, one that will fit either what they would call standard or even loose. I never understood the term loose fitting reserve, but you can put at least 2 different reserve sizes in just about every harness pack tray. So now those 300 main canopy combinations can now be added to 200 different reserve combinations. But wait, there's now low bulk reserves, right? Everything's changed. Now we've doubled the amount of reserves out there. So instead of 200, for every PDR 126 and 143, there's now an optimum 126 and 143, so we've now doubled it. Aerodyne's come out with a low bulk reserve. Icarus has a low bulk reserve. See where I'm going with this? All these different combinations. You could have a tight fitting reserve and a loose fitting main, a tight fitting main and a loose fitting reserve, a tight reserve and a tight main. There's over 1,000 different combinations of mains and reserves and harness containers. If you ever looked at the Paragear catalog and did the math, it's something like 12 to 1,400 different combinations. Now, the only question I'm going to ask you about this is, do you think anyone, Sunpath, UPT, Mirage, AirTech, Vigil, Aerodyne, anyone involved in this process, do you think they've had the opportunity to test all 1,400 different combinations?
Oh, yeah.
If they did, if everyone did, your $4,000 harness container would probably cost about $40,000. You know, the testing involved, and it's constantly evolving because harness containers are constantly being fine-tuned and polished. AADs are being fine-tuned and polished. Canopies are being created that never existed before. So it's always changing. Why do I tell you all this? I tell you all this is that I hope each one of you will take a moment when we're done here and talk to someone knowledgeable, local, rigger, and ask them their opinion on the compatibility of the components you have in your system. Do you have the right size reserve, the right size main, and how does that fit within the deployment system of your reserve parachute? If, this is the question, if my reserve had to activate in a total scenario, what's a total scenario? Main tray is still closed. Do I have the right combination of equipment? If my AAD had to activate with my main out, is it the right combination of equipment? You need to get an answer to both of those questions. The answer is probably yes, it's the right information, it's the right size and combination. But if you're the one person out there that it's not, and your rigger says, well, you know what, actually now that you mentioned it, now that you were proactive and you came to me and we looked at this and we took time to think about it in terms of AAD activations, maybe we want to consider a different reserve. Imagine you could save your life or save someone else's life by doing that. It's pretty awesome, isn't it? So I highly recommend everybody take stock of that equipment they have and find someone knowledgeable. Tom Parker's here from Sunpath. You've got Mark Prokos is here from UPT. Herman's here from Aerodyne. There's a number of different harness container manufacturers here, so you can even go straight to the source if you want. All right, so the next thing I want to address with AADs, landing area offsets. Okay, there's a couple of different types of landing area offsets. The most common one is the display jump. How many of you are display jumpers? How many of you have seen a display jump? Okay, damn, not a lot of people. All right, what's the primary worry of having an AAD on your back and being a display jumper? You're taking off in one location and you're landing somewhere else, right? It's critical to know not just the offset, but which way does it go, right? If I take off here and I land here, or I take off here and I land down here, which way do I offset the AAD? Does going up mean I land up? Because the Cyprus uses an arrow. I believe Vigil uses a plus or minus. So whether is it plus for the landing area or is it an arrow for the take? What is it? Well, do you guys know where the answer is to those questions?
Read the manual.
It's in the manual, yep. So I'm not going to answer that for you. I want you to ask Helmut, ask Willie, read the manual. But if you're a display jumper, you should be intimately concerned and familiar with the possible difference between your takeoff altitude and your landing altitude, and being really good about knowing that not just that you've got the right offsets, but that you're sure you have the right offsets. Because not being sure, in this case, can kill you. It can kill you in one of two ways. One, your AAD can activate or initiate an activation higher than it should as you're deploying your main, which could be a 2-out scenario, which can be fatal. Or it might not activate at all because it's a lower altitude than it thinks it is because you offset in the wrong direction. So you need to be sure if you are a demonstration jumper. And then also there are just some airports that have different drop zones or different locations. They take off from one location and they land somewhere else. Ted, Ryan, and I, time to time, we take off at one location, 12,350 feet, and we land at a different location at 15,000 feet. So we have to make sure that the offsets are appropriate. We landed at 17,000 feet a couple times. We landed at 16.9 last year. Yeah, so we're taking off and landing at different altitudes, so it's critical that we understand the difference in these offsets. Now here's something I want to take a second and have you look at. I'm going to get a sip of water. Just absorb the slide. Okay, so everybody's absorbed it? Feel good? We talked at the beginning of this presentation about the idea that that AAD is just a calculator, and that calculator has really got nothing to do necessarily with saving your life. It has to do with performing a function or not performing a function. And the subsequent aftermath of that function, pushing the piston with the cutter through the cylinder, if the closing loop is through the cutter, it will then hopefully start a sequence. That sequence is the reserve deployment sequence. There's 5 basic steps to the reserve deployment sequence. Let's see if I can do this without looking. It starts with the pilot chute, right? Pilot chute launches off your back. It's a spring-loaded pilot chute. Whether it's cylindrical or conical, it's still made of metal and it's compressed on your back and it launches off your back. It's heavy, it has mass, okay? Launches off your back. Second thing to happen is the bridle then gets extended, right? So the bridle is getting pulled off your back. Kind of like the dog running to the end of a leash. And what happens at the end of the leash? The dog stops. Well, in this case, when the bridle gets to its full extension, the next thing to happen is for the bag to come off your back, right? Bag comes off your back. As the bag comes off your back, it begins the payout of the lines. The lines start to pay out. First the free-stowed lines, hopefully. Then the locking stow lines. And then the last thing to come out is the reserve canopy, and inflation begins. It's important to understand in this process, it's simple. I didn't make it up. I just looked at a manual and figured it out pretty quickly. This is the 5 steps to the process. But ask yourself, what happens if the bridle comes out before the pilot chute? What is that called? Out of sequence deployment, right? Horseshoe. What if the bag comes off your back before the lines pay out? Bag strip, right? It doesn't happen very often, but it's possible. That's why we have the bungee locking stows to prevent the bag from, ever see those tablecloths where you pull the fabric and the plates and glasses stay? The reserve deployment system, it's possible to do the same thing. If the locking stows break, that bungee, that bag will come clean off your back, and the nicely folded reserve parachute will stay in your back probably for the rest of your life. So that's one of the reasons why riggers spend so much time ensuring that the locking stows and that rubber band, that bungee cord, are in good working order. So the key here, 2 things. One, the possibility of an out-of-sequence deployment. Well, what could cause an out-of-sequence deployment? What if I'm unstable on my side or on my back, and my reserve pilot chute catches my ankle? Anybody ever seen that happen on a main or reserve? Somebody wrap a pilot chute around their ankle? And what happens? Well, the bag is going to keep going because it's been opened and released into the relative wind. The lines are going to keep going. So we have a pilot chute, bag, line, bridle, canopy, out-of-sequence deployment. It's not a good place to be at any altitude. It's a terrible place to be at 750 feet going 78 miles per hour or faster, right? So we need to be aware of this sequence. Any of you AFF instructors out here? Okay, have you done AFF back when there was spring-loaded pilot chutes on people's back? Okay, just all hand deploy? All right, if you were an AFF instructor back when there was still spring-loaded main pilot chutes, what you would see on a deployment is the pilot chute would go up, and then it would come back down again. And then it would go back up, and it might come back down again, and eventually it would launch off your back. What was causing that? The burble of the two instructors, right? Within the USPA structure, we actually changed our process so that the main side instructor departs, giving more clean air to help get that pilot chute off your back. So we recognized that the two instructors were creating a burble, and you could see this pilot chute. It has mass, it's heavy, goes up, comes back down in the burble, which is basically what, a vacuum, sucking things back down in your back. And usually it clears and takes off. But every time that pilot chute has any kind of hesitation, what is the one thing that it eats up? Okay, three things. What are the three things it eats up? Time, altitude, and height. But height and altitude are the same, so we'll say two things. So, sorry, just got jet lagged. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of get everybody's attention to the idea that once this activation happens, this decision to push the cutter, once the reserve tray is open, it still doesn't mean you're in a great place yet. There's a lot of factors that can affect this deployment process. One of which is the burble effect. Now, what is the burble effect? I think I just kind of explained it to you with the spring-loaded pilot chute and the AFF instructors, but let me get some feedback from you. You guys tell me, what did I just say? What does that mean, the burble effect?
Yeah, you've got a vacuum.
Yep, the pilot chute stays in the burble on your back, and it takes time away from you. Time for this to start. This can get delayed, pilot chute, bridle, bag, line, canopy, if the pilot chute gets stuck in a burble. Now at 3,000 feet, it's not a big deal. 4,000 feet, AFF jumps when you're deploying at 5,000 feet. It's actually kind of fun and funny to watch it because you see the instructors, and it's almost like they're playing tennis. They hit the pilot chute across to the other one hits it back to them, and eventually it goes off into the clean blue sky. But that's funny and comical, but what happens at 750 feet isn't very funny, and it's not very comical when this burble effect occurs. So let me ask you a question, and there is no right answer to this, at least no one absolute, but I have theories on it. What is the worst possible body position to have an AAD activation at 750 feet? What's that? Belly to earth, yes. That is one of the worst possible body positions. Hear me out on this one, okay? Okay. What's the one thing that there's a lot of things. What is one of the things that we teach AFF students to do when they're deploying is to reach back. If they can't find the handle, if they're going for the reserve, they can't find it, what are they supposed to do? Keep looking, right? We do not train people to go back to a belly to earth orientation and allow the AAD to do its job. We teach them to continue to fight and try to find it. Why do we do that? Break the burble, yes. Going to go slightly shoulder low, at least on your left side. You may even go slightly unstable. Now, if I'm on my side and the earth is that way and I'm whistling towards the ground, if that reserve pilot chute launches off my back, is it in clean air? Pretty good place to be, right? Ideally, reserve parachutes have their best chance for success in a head-high, seated orientation. And there's some old-school skydivers that still deploy their mains that way. They get ready to deploy, and they rear themselves up into a seated position to allow their spring-loaded pilot chutes to launch off their back into clean air beside them. Anyone seen a skyhook video or demonstration? You're falling away from it. You're falling outward. The pilot chute wants to go out into clean air. Turn that 90 degrees, it's not going into clean air if it's on your back. Now, I'm not saying roll over onto your back if you're on your belly. I'm not saying that's the place to be either. I just want you to think about it, that the reason why we say never give up is if you're down and your arms are in, one, you should always be trying to save your own life. But two, if your arms are in a nice, perfect box, man, what are you doing? You're creating an enormous burble on your back. And it may only cost you a half a second, but if that half a second is between 750 feet and 650 feet, is that some place you want to give up a half a second? No, you want clean air going over your back. So we talked about this earlier as well. Free fall speeds in excess of 120 miles per hour. AAD activation altitudes and free fall speeds. There's so many different combinations and so many different parameters between what we choose to do with skydiving, what kind of free fall speeds that puts us in, both high and low. But our AAD activation altitudes are basically set in two different parameters. There's the belly to earth and back to earth. They don't really change. We're what's changing, not the AADs. Loss of altitude awareness continues to put people in the basement, for lack of a better term. Continues to cause two-out scenarios. A two-out scenario can be deadly. Main reserve entanglement can be caused simply by losing altitude awareness. How can we prevent losing altitude awareness? Multiple altimeters, right? If we have a wrist mount, we have a wrist mount and an audible. Maybe we have a wrist mount, an audible, another audible. Everyone has different risk tolerances, but you need to think about what yours are. Now here's an interesting one. Muscle memory decision, main or reserve. Who here has 5,000 skydives or more? Okay, 5,000 skydives. How many reserve malfunctions have you had in 5,000?
More than a dozen.
Okay. You need a new packer. We'll talk about that after the class. Okay, but so let's call it 12. Okay, and on those 12, were any of them totals? Like we just went straight to reserve, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know about how many? One, all of them, half of them?
4 or 5 maybe.
Okay, and I'm just asking this question to build a picture. I want to give you guys a sight picture here. What's your total jump number?
11,000 something.
11,000 times. What's your name?
Andy.
Andy. 11,000 times. Andy has reached back. You are right-handed, right? Okay. He's reached back and he's thrown his main pilot chute, his primary. Done that 11,000 times. Any of you guys read Malcolm Gladwell, any of his books? To be a virtuoso at anything, you need to do it at least 10,000 times. So a virtuoso of pilot chute throwing here. He has this subconscious mind to throw his pilot chute 11,000 times. Okay. Half a dozen reserve activations that required going straight to the reserve. The other half were probably streamers or bag locks or line overs, packing errors or whatever was going on. In 11,000 jumps, only 6 times have we gone straight to reserve. Okay. So statistically speaking, when someone loses altitude awareness, and I bet none of those were due to lack of altitude awareness. They're probably doing regular skydiving, things went wrong. Let's say on the next skydive, we lose altitude awareness. Okay, we've now blown through, what's your decision altitude?
2 grand-ish.
2 grand. Okay, we've blown through 2 grand. We're free flying on our head, the two of us. We're going 150, 60 miles an hour. We lose altitude awareness. You roll over on your belly under 1,800 feet. What's going to happen? Is he going to go for his reserve, or is he going to throw out his main pilot chute? Statistically speaking, the main pilot chute is going to come out. Because we do it, in this case, 11,000 times. I've done it 5,000 times. You've done it how many? 5,000 times. When everything goes right, it's easy. It's when things don't go right. Do you ever think about the idea of losing altitude awareness, rolling over and it's 1,200 feet, and think about what the appropriate course of action is? You have an armed AAD on your back. It's going to fire. It's going to activate. Is reaching back and setting my pilot chute at 1,200 feet the right decision? Or is going straight to my reserve the right decision, because that's coming out anyway, no matter what I do with the main parachute? Most people will throw their pilot chute because it's what's ingrained in their head to do at every altitude. The right altitude and even the wrong altitude. So we see a lot of two-out malfunctions that way. Thankfully, people survive, and we get a chance to interview them and ask them, so we kind of get this information back, thankfully. We don't have to guess at it. But think about that. Think about your emergency procedures in that capacity. How many of you, and I'm guilty of it too, take the time to think about what would happen if I rolled over and it was 1,300 feet? I'm only human. I'm fallible as the next person. I can make a mistake. If I roll over at 1,300 feet, am I going to reach for my pilot chute, or am I going to have the mental strength to know that for me, I need to go straight to my reserve because that reserve's coming out anyway? I think about it. I think about it because I want to make sure it's in my consciousness so that if I find myself there, I'm prepared for it. Because I don't want to be asking which one at 1,200 feet above 78 miles per hour, right? So when this was I first did this presentation 2 years ago at the PIA Symposium, there was 11 fatalities. We're now over 13. It goes across all brands of harness container manufacturers, all brands of canopies, AADs, reserves. There's no one specific combination that we can tie to any of this. PIA has been doing a lot of research on this, our Parachute Industry Association. So there's no one answer. We can't say, don't jump this container size with this canopy combination with this AD. It just doesn't work that way. It's not any one answer. But the reason I bring it up is that that's how important this is. There's a whole 1,200 to 1,400 combination mix of pieces of equipment out there. There's a whole varied group of different skydiving disciplines standing or sitting in front of me here. All of this evolved after the AD came out. After the AD's conception, its perfection, its improvements, after all that occurred, we change the parameters within which we put that magical calculator that's falling through the sky with us. And we need to know all of the parameters. It's no different than our parachutes. It's no different than our harness containers. It's that important to have the same understanding. We can't afford to be a set it and forget it society. For skydivers, we have to know the information. So one of my favorite sayings is knowledge is power. Read the manual, whether it's a Vigil 2 or a Cyprus 2. If you don't have it already, go download it. And if you haven't read it, I implore you to please go read the manual from cover to cover. If you don't understand something, or even if you don't agree with something, ask questions. Ask questions of the manufacturers. Ask questions of their road reps that are out there on their behalf. It's critical to understand the parameters of the AADs and all of the information within each harness container manufacturer, each canopy manufacturer, and each AAD manufacturer. All of that is available on their websites. It's all free now on the internet. You don't have to send for postage or anything like that. So I'm going to end the story with my or end the presentation with my friend George. Helmut, you actually saved the life of a friend of mine. His name is George. In Pepperell, Massachusetts, back in 2003, okay, maybe 2004, 2003, 2004. George wasn't a great skydiver. He's still alive, so I'm speaking in the current tense. But George wasn't a great skydiver, but he was a decent enough skydiver to pass AFF. He started in his older years. I think he went through AFF in his mid-50s, so he didn't have the same athletic reception to it that someone maybe at 18 or 20 would have if they started when they were younger. He wasn't into any other kind of physical activity. He ran a restaurant. He was a chef, so he's a little overweight, spent all day on his feet cooking. He used to show up exhausted at the end of the day. He got on current over the winter and went to make a recurrency jump. It was cold out, so what did he do? He put gloves on. He never jumped with gloves. He put gloves on. He went up, he made a fun jump. He turned and tracked away, and with those slippery, thick gloves, guess what he couldn't get a hand on? Couldn't get a hand on his pilot chute. So he's whistling into the snow. He says, okay, I need to pull the reserve. He goes down, tries to pull the reserve. He can't find it because he's got a big floppy suit on. He's got a sweater underneath it because it's cold. So what does he do? He goes back into a neutral body position. And what does he do? He waits for the AAD to activate. Okay? He had a Cyprus activation in a boxman position at 750 feet or lower, approximately above 78 miles per hour. The AAD activated, and it saved his life. So had anything gone wrong in that scenario that I had painted for you, the deployment process, any delays in that 5-step sequence, I wouldn't have George's restaurant to keep going home to now when I go visit home in Boston. It's that serious. People are out there doing that. And George is a smart guy. That's the other thing. Probably should have changed his name to, like, I don't know, Ryan or something like that. But George is a really smart guy. He's not an idiot. And he didn't know any better at the time. He never would have thought he'd have been the guy that couldn't find his main or his reserve. But what he didn't put thought into was the concept of never give up. We don't focus enough on that in our sport. I know you focus on that all the time in your day-to-day life on the mountain. Never give up, okay? So if I can leave you with that, and that alone, I have succeeded. But if everything else that I've said, if it gives you guys something to talk about and things to consider, then I will have considered this a successful afternoon. So I thank you for your time. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. But really, the person to ask here is Helmut, and Willie's out in the other room for Vigil. By all means, thank you all for your time and your consideration. Appreciate it.